Welcome to this video lecture on macroeconomic equilibrium. This is discussed in chapter 33 primarily, also a little bit in chapter 34. This is the longest video, the most complicated topic that we're going to study in the short-run fluctuation unit. So I'd recommend watching this probably more than once, using the helpful hints, doing the practice problems, and then coming to office hours, because this one is going to take the most work of anything we study in the short-run fluctuations unit. So here's our generic aggregate supply aggregate demand diagram. We're going to have two aggregate supply curves as discussed in SF4, a long-run aggregate supply that's vertical, and a short-run aggregate supply that slopes upward. And then of course we have our aggregate demand, which we've studied extensively. We're going to make a simplifying assumption in all of these diagrams that long-run aggregate supply does not change, because we want to focus on the short-run here, and short-run changes in aggregate supply and demand. It'll make everything simpler to draw if we just leave the long-run aggregate supply curve fixed. We know of course that this is not correct, that in the long-run aggregate supply continues to shift outward because labor, capital, and technical knowledge continue to increase. But over very short time spans, like 1 or 2 years, it's not a particularly bad assumption. So in addition to distinguishing between long-run and short-run aggregate supply curves, we're going to distinguish between long-run equilibria, which is where aggregate demand intersects long-run aggregate supply, and short-run equilibria, where aggregate demand intersects short-run aggregate supply. And in general, we're going to have two of each on our diagrams. We'll have an initial long-run equilibrium where we start from, then we'll have some kind of shock that shifts us to a new short-run equilibrium, and then we'll have the long-run equilibrium that our economy eventually transitions to. So the initial short-run and long-run equilibrium are usually the same point, then we'll have a short-run response and a long-run response. So let's start by thinking about a positive demand shock. So we start at some equilibrium level in short-run and long-run equilibrium, and suppose business confidence increases. Maybe it's totally irrationally. So businesses are just investing a lot, perhaps in housing. So this would be the situation in the mid-2000s. So there's a ton of investment in residential housing. This is shifting the aggregate demand curve out because the level of investment is high, and that's the most volatile component of AD. And that's going to lead us to a new short-run equilibrium where this new AD curve intersects with the short-run aggregate supply curve. And you'll see on the graph on the next slide that both Y and P are higher in this case, so we call that an inflationary gap, primarily because economists like to focus on the negative instead of the positive. So we focus on the fact that prices are higher, that this is inflationary, not the fact that output is higher, which is presumably a good thing. So here we see the inflationary gap on the diagram. It's the difference between the equilibrium Y in the short run and the initial equilibrium Y for the long run. You can see E short run here on the diagram. This is our short run equilibrium. It's where the short run aggregate supply intersects the new aggregate demand curve. And this part of the diagram is not particularly complicated, but we just want you to, we want you to practice drawing this. So I'd like you to practice drawing this, pause the video, and draw out these components and make sure you understand them, why the AD curve shifted, and how we got from the initial equilibrium to the new short run equilibrium, because things are going to start to get a little bit more complicated from here on out. So at this point, we're in a short run equilibrium, but we know we need to eventually get to a long run equilibrium. So how are we going to transition? We saw that in this inflationary gap, some firms have increased prices. The price level has increased. But we know, if we're sticking to the sticky price story about aggregate supply, which is what we'll do throughout this video and for the rest of the course, that other firms had sticky prices, so they didn't adjust their prices up. We know that in the long run, everybody expects that these firms with sticky prices will adjust their prices upward. So all firms, both those that adjust and those that do not, and consumers, everyone in the economy knows that prices are going to increase in the long run. As you remember from chapter 33, when the expected price level increases, we shift the short run aggregate supply to the left. So we're going to get a slow, persistent decrease in aggregate supply over time as firms adjust to that new, higher expected price level, shifting short run aggregate supply back until we eventually reach an intersection between the new AD and the new short run aggregate supply on the long run aggregate supply curve. So we'll see that on the next slide. We started here now in short run equilibrium, but we know that the price level is going to start to increase because some firms will eventually become unstuck from their current price level at the sticky price. So we'll get a short run aggregate supply curve here, and then it will continue to shift back to here, and then eventually it will shift all the way back until we reach the long run aggregate supply curve and return to a new long run equilibrium. So this is our new long run equilibrium. Two features of this new long run equilibrium are important. One is that because the long run aggregate supply curve hasn't shifted, the GDP in the long run has to be the same as it was before the aggregate demand shock. The second feature is that prices are now permanently higher. There was a burst of inflation in response to the first aggregate demand shock. Firms raised their prices along the original short run aggregate supply curve. And then since other prices were stuck with sticky prices, but slowly became unstuck, they were able to raise their prices too, and we slowly got to this final higher price level. So there was an initial burst of inflation and then more inflation after that as we return back to our long run GDP. The questions for this short video ask you to repeat the process, but for a negative aggregate demand shock. So suppose business confidence declines, investment declines, you're going to shift the aggregate demand curve and see that how Y and P are affected in the short run. We call this a recessionary gap. It will be very clear why on your graph. And then I want you to show us how you transition to the long run from that point. Doing this one practice problem probably isn't even close to enough to developing proficiency with this type of graph. There's a great saying that they attribute to Julie Andrews that amateurs practice until they don't make a mistake, professionals practice until they can't make a mistake. You want to be a professional and practice drawing these types of diagrams until you can't make a mistake, until you understand all the concepts in depth. Because if it's possible to make a mistake, unfortunately, you often will make a mistake on an exam. So practicing this one time is definitely not enough. And then the second question asks you about the recessionary gap in question number 1 is 5%. So we want you to estimate how unemployment has changed using Okun's law. If you haven't seen the video on Okun's law, it's pretty short and pretty straightforward. So go ahead and watch that video and do this question. That's my recommendation. If not, you can wait until the next section, SF6, where we're going to talk about Okun's law. Thanks for watching.